You who were in Sunday school this morning, listening to that series, Starting Point by Andy Stanley, you would have heard just an absolute beautiful introduction to what I want to talk about today. It's sort of like some of the backstory behind what I'm going to share, because he focuses so much of that message on the individual, and I'm trying to focus the message more on us as a collected group, as I have done this, worked through this series on the nature of the church. You know, what can we learn about who we are as the gathered assembly of the followers of God, the called out ones, as we learned about in the first message, that we're called out from the world, that you're here together, and you're called into the eternal kingdom. And what does that look like? And we looked at how we have been created by our Creator to be creative ourselves, that we have that ability and free will that we can put something into existence that hasn't been there before. We looked at how we've been created to live in community. Adam didn't do so well when he was just by himself. And so Eve was created. Equal partners, being able to then be united in a community where I think it is in that relationship and as we relate to one another that we reflect the image of God. And then last week we were looking at, okay, so we're created for community. We're created to be creative, and then, but what happens is sometimes we're in conflict. So are we really created for conflict? But we really shouldn't be too surprised when we have differences, because if we gather together to do something, we're probably going to have different ideas about just what that should look like and how it should be done. Makes me wonder if there's probably even arguments about whether, like, those gates should be shut or they should not be shut. You know, because it's an inconvenience, but yet. So it's that's a pain if the waters don't rise high enough to need those gates to shut. But if you want them shut, though, if it rises too high, but we have different ideas about how do you manage that? How do you have a policy? And we can get into conflict with each other. And we looked at the conflict of Jacob and Esau and how they used their incredible creativity, Jacob and Rebekah, his mother, to steal the blessing from Esau, something that was supposed to unify and strengthen the family, and it ended up being something that was very divisive and really practically destroyed the relationship between Esau and Jacob, to the extent that Esau wanted to kill Jacob, and so Jacob had to flee to his uncle Laban at the advice of his mother. And I talked a little bit about how that came down through a family that has a little bit of dysfunction when it comes to the way they operate with each other as a family, like we all do. We all have some level of dysfunction. And it didn't just start with us. It was our parents. It was their parents, the parents before that. It goes down through the generations. I mean, none of us are perfect. So what is our hope then? If we're going to be asked to live in community, what is our hope in trying to get along with each other, to accomplish what God has asked us to do or maybe is leading us to do? And today I want to back up and I want to talk about Abraham and Sarah. And I'm basically going to stick with those names even though they haven't been changed yet in this passage. But as I talk about them, I'm going to use Abraham and Sarah instead of Abram and Sarai, or however you would like to pronounce that. And something that happened with them in Genesis chapter 16. But before I read that, and we just sang that song, Ancient Words, and Andy Stanley pointed this out too, that this is nearly 4,000 years ago what we're reading about. And he made a really great point about how many, he asked the people that were in their, wherever this assembly is, where they were in his church, how many of them have heard of Abraham? And nearly everybody raised their hand. And then he named, and I don't know his name, it's like King Cheddar, it was something kind of like that. It was a much longer name than that. But the king who was actually the one that was well known during Abraham's time, nobody had ever heard of him. So there's something really significant about that. Not just that we all know about him, but it's also Abraham is considered to be the starting point, the root of all the three major faiths of Islam, of Judaism, and of Christianity. And And in this story, we're going to see how there was a problem here where God had promised that Abraham would become this great nation, that he would have descendants that they could outnumber the stars, and yet he doesn't even have a son. And he's getting old. And Sarah's getting old. Probably well past the age of childbearing. And yet today, there are over 3 billion people who ascribe to one of those three faiths who has its starting point back in Abraham. It's a really, really cool history to think about where things were, which we have in Genesis 16. And I don't have the Pew Bible number, but I want to start reading and kind of preaching through a little bit this passage in Genesis 16. And I want you to look at Abraham and Sarah in this, not as much as sort of the ancient forefathers, the patriarch, matriarch of our faith that's so many years ago, but think about them as being the first church. I mean, if we are the assembly of the called out ones, that's what they were. They and their family and all of their servants, they were the called out ones. God told them to come out to a land that I'm going to show you. And they were called to be a part of an eternal kingdom that they really didn't understand very well. They weren't quite sure what the purpose of all this was, other than God promising him a place, descendants, and that God would keep his covenant with them. So what I want to try and compare today is, what does it mean to be a group that lives in covenant with each other? What can we learn about? And that's what this blue sheet is. I ran out of blue, so there's some white ones too, but if you don't have this blue sheet that says A Tale of Two Churches on it, if you could raise your hand, and one of the ushers could get that for you. But I think you'll be able to follow along with this a little bit better, because what we're going to look at is Church A and Church B and their core values. And I think we can learn a lot from this as we listen to this story of Sarai and Abram. So I want to begin here by reading Genesis 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." And Abram agreed to what Sarai. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Not everything's going quite like planned. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. It's your fault. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, and I'm not, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." And then Abram says, "Your servant is in your hands. Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. Little domestic abuse of some sort going on there. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert, and it was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count." And the angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now with child, and you will have a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her, "You are the God who sees me." For she says, "I have now seen the one who sees me." And that is why the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. I want to set that story aside for just a minute and look at the first half of this blue document that lists the core values of Church A. And I'll get to the church of what the fill in the blank there eventually. But if I was looking for a church, I would like this. I like these core values that are listed here. Like, for example, core value number 1 is that the individuals choose and create community as they deem necessary. I mean, that is pretty Anabaptist, isn't it? We don't believe in hierarchy. We don't want some religious leader who is way up above us dictating what we're going to do in our local congregation. I think that's really nice. I mean, we can have a conversation about that, do what we want to do. Core value number 2, it fosters a union of interest. Is this church helping me grow and meeting my needs? I mean, that's why I come to church. I want to know, is it serving my needs? I kind of like that one. Core value number 3, it locates religious authority and accountability in the individual's personal relationship with God. That is something that I would like to have too, because let's say I've been worshiping here with all of you for, let's say, 10 years, and then there's something that happens, like the way you redid all this back of the sanctuary, and I just don't like that. I don't like what you did with it. And this is up to me in my personal relationship with God, that I think we should have done something a whole lot more fabulous and added on to the back of the church. Whatever it could be, if I decide that that's the way that I think God is leading us, and you're not going to go that way, there is not 1 ounce of guilt for me to walk out the door and find another church that I'm in a little more agreement with. I mean, doesn't that sounds kind of good to me too. Then core value number 4, the members of Church A recognize their relationships are conditional, and if the community ceases to meet my needs, the relationship is legitimately nullified. That basically means for any reason that I decide, I can walk out the door and I don't have to feel 1 ounce of guilt about leaving you behind. Because it's not meeting my needs. That's where I want the church to be. Well, if we can imagine Abraham and Sarah being a part of this congregation, just listen a little bit to how it went for them. So if we look at the first core value, that the members get to choose and create community as they deem necessary. And we get to decide what this looks like. Get to decide who's in, who's out, how it all happens. But we see a problem with this almost immediately, because God was initially deciding what the community was going to be by saying, Abraham and Sarah, I'm promising you a child. Okay, that was God's idea of their community. And then Sarah is saying, now wait a minute. If Abraham is going to be the father of many nations, we don't have any children at all, somebody better get this party started, because I just cannot have kids anymore. I'm too old. So here's something we can do. How about Hagar and Abraham? You two get together and see if you can have a son that way. Who's deciding what the community looks like? It's Sarah and Abraham going along with that. So Sarah belongs, I would say, to this church that cares about her interests, and it fosters whatever she decides will help her grow and what is going to meet her needs, which is the core value number 2. Is the church helping me grow and meeting my needs? Okay, so how did that work out? I mean, it's in a very brief 16 or so verses there in chapter 16, but it's problematic. It didn't take Sarah long to decide that having Hagar as a surrogate for her was not really what she wanted. Hagar began to despise Sarah, and Sarah didn't have much use for Hagar. So how is it that fostering these first couple of values, these core values, ends up creating such contempt for one another in this church? They sound good, but then I begin to think, well, maybe I don't want to be a part of a church that's quite like that. Core value number 3, it locates the authority and accountability in the church's mutual... Well, I'm getting ahead of myself on that one. I wanted the other core value number 3. That it locates religious authority and accountability in the individual's personal relationship with God. So when Sarah makes that decision that God is asleep or out to lunch or something, so I'm going to take up the authority to make the decision about where we're going to go with this. And Abraham honors that. It's like, okay, we'll do that. And then with core value number 4, after this pregnancy happens, and after Sarah does not enjoy being around Hagar anymore and vice versa, she recognizes the core value 4. These relationships are conditional, and if the community ceases to meet my needs, the relationship is legitimately nullified. So she begins abusing her to the extent that finally Hagar just leaves and flees for her own sense of safety, which leaves her very vulnerable in a very patriarchal society. If you didn't have a man taking care of you, a lot of other men wouldn't want anything to do with you now that you're already pregnant. That doesn't sound so great. Well, I'd like to take a look at another possibility, and that's the bottom half of this, and that's Church B. The core values in Church B have a lot more to do with covenant. And here you'll begin to see how this differs from that first church. In Church B, the core value number 1 is that the community is the choice and gift of God. Andy Stanley said really well how Abraham was just an ordinary person, but God had to start somewhere. So he started with Abraham. And when God made that initial covenant with Abraham to make him a great nation, God had him do this thing where they would take pigeons and other animals and they would cut them in half and then lay them in 2 rows, the halves on each side. And the way the covenant would normally work then is that both parties would walk down through the middle of it, but in this one, it's only God who goes down through the middle of it. And it's almost like saying, Abraham, regardless of what you do and how you may fail, I am going to stay in covenant relationship with you and your descendants, even if you don't with me. That's pretty different than just having individuals choose the community that works for them. It's God that initiates the community, and it's God who invites. The second core value is that it fosters a union of persons. Like we give of our very selves to each other. What do you think it would have looked like if Sarah would have been able to see her relationships around her as being a covenant relationship where she really sought the interest of the other people around her, even as she would seek her own interest? In Philippians chapter 2, Paul encourages the church at Philippi to do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but rather in humility value others above yourselves. And I love this statement. Don't look only to your own interests, but look to the interests of other people. What if Sarah would have been able to find it within herself to say, this is really painful that I can't have children. But I can't just put my frustration and anger on Hagar. I need to look out for Hagar's interest too, and what she needs. And what we did was something we asked her to do. So it's not just her responsibility. We've kind of helped create this mess for each other. But Sarah wasn't doing that. She didn't take any responsibility for her choices, and neither was Abraham, who was so willing to sleep with Hagar, get her pregnant, and then just allow Sarah to treat her however she wanted to, even to drive her out of the house. Gave her permission to mistreat her. What if everybody in this story could have worked at trying to hold the pain that Sarah and Abraham were experiencing? What if they could together ask, God, what are you doing? Why are you waiting so long? What is it about this promise, this covenant that you made with us, and we're here childless? This Church B, the last half of this page, it tries to do that kind of questioning. And It locates authority and accountability in the church's mutual discernment. It's not leaving it up to just one person. But Sarah's interpretation of God's absence was, the Lord has kept me from having children. Rather than bringing Abraham into the conversation and trying to discern together what that meant, they went ahead of God. As Anabaptists, we have a rooted belief that discernment lies in the whole of the church and not just one part of it or in one person. And Sarah didn't really seem to be open to any other opinion about what she ought to do about being infertile at 75 years of age than to just grab a hold of some kind of handle to turn these wheels of history to make sure that something is going to be written about Abraham and his descendants. And core value number 4 of Church B is that relationships are unconditional. They're grounded in in the self-giving and steadfast love of God. But Sarah says to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman. And she can't even see her as a person and call her by name. It's just that woman, that slave woman. Because that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son. She kind of operates out of Church A. Just hasn't quite found a way to get down to Church B. Now, I've said before that in Hebrews 1, it talks about Jesus being the exact representation of God, and he told his disciples, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. What did we see in Jesus? In terms of how he operated in relationship with those around him, even those who hated him. In Philippians, Paul writes, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used for his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. What would the church be like if we could empty ourselves like that? To let go of our need to be right. To let go of our need to be the ones who decide. I've done a lot of work with churches in conflict, and there's always this issue or that issue or another issue. There's always a presenting issue there. But it often, and I would say by far, a very high majority of the time, what it is really about is who gets to decide. Whatever the issue is. What would it be like if we could free ourselves from that and commit as a community, a covenant community, to release that to the Lord, to work together toward finding our way forward? If I was going to give names to these two different churches, and that's what the blanks are for, Church A, I would call the church of the transaction. It's contractual. It's this kind of an arrangement, it just protects my interests. I might care about your interests, but by and large, it's really protecting my interests so that if there's anything that happens that I feel like my interests aren't being looked out for, I can leave and break fellowship with you, bless you on your way, and I'll go on mine. Church B is a church of what I would call transformation. And I think that transformation comes when we're willing to say, I have an opinion. I don't know if it's the answer. I'm getting really pretty not humble if I think my answer is the answer. When other people who also are called by God's name, who have the indwelling of God's Holy Spirit, are speaking something different than what I am thinking, can I listen to that? Is it possible that the person that I have the most broken relationship with has the very thing to tell me that I need to hear? in order to heal. And do you remember what Jacob and Esau, how that worked with them when they finally came back together? And they were so nervous about seeing each other again. At least Jacob was. He was shaking in his boots because Esau had also become a powerful person. And this is the person that hated him, that wanted to kill him. And when they came back together, and Jacob hugged him and he said, "Seeing you is like seeing the face of God." There's something about that carries such a big dose of humility, because it's almost like if you could go to the person who has seen you at the very worst, and Esau saw Jacob at his dirtiest, and they express love to you anyway, that's like seeing the face of God. The person who knows everything, all of our secrets, our skeletons in the closet, whatever they are, but they're able to hold us and call us a brother or a sister. That starts to begin to touch on what a covenant community is. And one of the things that I really like about these narratives that have been preserved for us in Genesis is that it just shows that God doesn't just stay down here in Church B. God comes up to Church A with us. What happened to Hagar was terrible, but God met Hagar where she was, an outcast of Church A. So much so that, at one point she was going to just lay her child under a bush because there was no more water to drink. They're out in the desert and just going to let Ishmael die. But God saw her. The people in Church A, that God sees us. God didn't give up on his promise to Abraham and Sarah. He still went ahead, even with Ishmael, brought a son to Abraham in his old age. That's part of God's covenant of continuing to walk with us, continuing to follow us. How many of you would agree that our world desperately needs that kind of community? That we need to know what it's like to be a part of a covenant community where we're not just looking out for our interests, but we're looking out for basically the salvation of every person. And I don't just mean whether you're accepting Christ as your Savior. I mean salvation in the big sense, which is a wholeness, a total healing in all areas of your life. What if we were looking out for one another in that way? In one of the churches where I pastored, I wasn't there when this happened, but it would have been decades before, as he was sharing this story with me, and he was sharing it with the group. He was just thinking back to when they had just had a child who was born with Down syndrome. And he walked up to the front of the church carrying this child. And he said, "I don't know what the next decades and what these next years have in store for us as a family. But I do know this, that God is with me and with us. And I also know that you are with us." The congregation. That is where the power of a covenant community comes out. That's the thing that I think, it fascinates the world to see that kind of thing. Because we see each other, just like God saw Hagar when nobody else did. And this would be my challenge in thinking about being a church of covenant rather than contract or transactional. Be a church of covenant and transformation is this. Can you be a community that can say, God sees you and we see you? No matter who walks through that door, no matter who is attending here, can we say that? God sees you and we see you. God is with you and we are with you. And even if you feel like God isn't hearing you, we hear you. God says over and over through Scripture, do not be afraid. But I think the church can carry that on in a covenant relationship with one another, and to anyone who comes by, we can carry that to say, don't be afraid. We're going to be here for each other. So which church do you want to be a part of? As you look at that list, would you like to be a part of Church A, or would you like to be a part of Church B? We are not people of a divine contract. We're people of a divine covenant. We failed the contract a long time ago. We didn't hold up our end of the agreement. But thankfully, we are a people of the divine covenant. And as I was telling the children in the children's story, God knows each of you by name, says, I have called you, I've redeemed you, and I love you. It's in Isaiah 43. And you are mine. We are the very children of God. We're going to close with singing in the hymnal worship book, number 433, Go, My Children. Could we stand together as we sing this sending song?